questions left over from before? If not, I thought that I would talk for a little while and use some slides and remind you where we were and what we were talking about in the previous sessions. But perhaps there's some question to begin with.
Questions?
Okay. Okay, then I'll share screen. You can still ask questions, but let me get the share screen working.
Yes.
All right. So, just one moment here. I wanted to begin by reminding, let's see here, let's get this working. There. There. All right, so this was something that we did before, and I'm just reviewing it, but this is a photomicrograph of DNA, closed circular DNA molecule, which was produced by Stasiak, Spengler, and Cazarelli in the 1980s first, and it was the regarded as solid evidence that DNA can be knotted because they understand how the photomicrograph is made, and they understand that it can be interpreted as a knot diagram. So this is an example of the use of the basic part of the knot theory, the idea of representing things by diagrams, in reference to a reality that's really quite far away in the sense of size. And the interpretation of this is that this bit of molecule here is spatially going over that one, and then under, and then over, 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 and then under, alternating, and you get a certain knot diagram. And if you drew it, it would look like this. And here I have drawn it, just an example of what one can do. One can make a drawing of this kind in a program that will then make it more three-dimensional. This is a flat diagram like the flat micrograph, but we'd like to understand the knot geometrically. You could have woven it with a piece of rope and played with it that way. We could easily do that, but here I decided to illustrate this by making the drawing in the program and then running the program, which self-repels it. Each of these nodes is repelling every other node, like an electrical force, and so it pulls itself apart. But the program doesn't allow sticks to cross through one another, and so it remains in its topological class. And you can also coat all of that with a tube if you want for visualization purposes, and the program then proceeds to repel it further, and you end up like this with a three-dimensional version. And so it is interesting to pursue the relationships between things that might be in a different world, like the DNA, and models that we can work with in this world. I don't remember whether we actually used the program, illustrated the program, but it's fun to do this. So let me just run that program and go through the same thing that we did here. I need to find the program in this list of things. It starts with a K. or not plot. There it is. There are these funny little obstructions that occur because of meeting graphics. Out of the way. All right. Come along. Oh, I see. There. There. All right. There's the drawing. And as I said, very flat. It's flat drawing like that. And we're going to run the program, which will cause these to self-repel, and it also pulls in because of absence or presence of spring forces between the points, but it reaches a place where that's an equilibrium, and then it's just repelling. So it gets smaller first, then larger, and here we are in its self-repelled form. And there are many things that you can do here to investigate geometrical properties of knots by using a program of this type. This is the example that I was just showing you. But let's try something else just for the sake of an illustration. And I don't remember whether I tried this before, but this is a good one. Let me stop this and then start again. So here is a torus knot, and it's also mostly almost a flat diagram, but you can see that it's winding on the surface of a torus, and it winds 3 times this way for twice this way on the surface of a torus. Yeah? And what will happen when we self-repel this? The program allows you to see a measure of the energy of the system, and I'm going to let it self-repel. We might as well put some tubes around it. And you see it's pushing away from itself, and it's coming into a certain kind of equilibrium. I don't see it showing the energy on the screen, and I'm not going to go worrying about the energy. Then we'll just turn it off. But the energy is always going down. The energy is a measure of totally how far apart it is from itself in a certain sense. So so here we are, and it's coming into this kind of particular form where you see that it's like an ear, and then there's another ear over here. And these two are sitting in equilibrium with one another. And if you were to look at it from a certain point of view, you would see that it's twisting on itself once, twice around, basically 3 times around, and it has this form. But if I allow it to undergo some perturbation, and that's what that amounts to, is allowing the spring forces to actually come into effect in the modeling in the program. If I allow that, then it can begin to move a little bit. And now it's exchanging some kinetic and potential energy between the spring forces and the self-repelling forces. So this makes it a little more like a real physical system. And what you're going to see is that it's going into an oscillation, and it's actually an uncontrolled oscillation. You'll see it will flip over at a certain point. We're doing a real-time experiment, so I can't say when, but I think you see it. Those swings are getting a little wider, and I have done this before, so I'm confident that it will flip over in a moment or two. And the flip over, after it does it, will drive it down to a lower energy level, and the knot will have, because the only energy that I'm talking about measuring is the geometrical energy of how far apart it is from itself, not the kinetic energy of the particles in the knot, which are now moving. Maybe you don't believe me. After all, an experiment is an experiment. It's a little small.
It makes me sleepy.
It will. It will.
It's like doing a
This is
meditation.
like perform for us, right? But give it a moment. And the thing that's interesting here is that there is an energy landscape, right? You have local places where the knot is in a kind of a minimum, and it won't go away. And then here we go. Now it's swinging more. And if it gets out of one of those local minimum by a perturbation, then it can flip over, in this case, have more kinetic energy and drop its geometrical energy a little lower to a different geometrical form. And that's what's now happening.
So where is the input of the energy?
Well, this is an artificial situation. So what I'm calling the energy, we set it up in a potential energy situation to begin with. There's forces that are repelling it, and we're measuring the reciprocal of the distances between the points and adding them all up and calling that an energy, because it would correspond to an energy if these were real points. But there is no real energy happening here. There's only a configuration that's moving, of course. But now you see the basic form of it is a much simpler form of a trefoil knot than the one that we had to begin with. And there is kinetic energy in the movement of the system that wasn't there before, and I can drain that out because the program has a way of just knocking it out, slowing or getting rid of that part motion. And then it becomes this geometrical entity that looks more like just the simplest trefoil knot you'll ever see. And that is, in fact, representing the least energy level that's possible for this knot. There are higher energy levels and lower ones like that. And you can do experiments of this kind. I'll do one more just for the fun of it, of a knot of this kind. I'll start with a torus knot of type 5-2 instead of 3-2. But let's make sure. Yeah. 5-2. There. Now, this is a very similar experiment, but there's more winding. It goes 5 times around the torus one way to twice around the other way. And we'll do exactly the same thing and see what happens. Down she goes and up she goes. and it wraps around it. It ends up wrapping around itself like this with that braiding in the middle. It'll be easier to see if we bring the radius down. And then I'll let it go into its undamped, and then it unfurls, and then it will also, you see, you think that braid is stable, but it isn't. Oh, it's very unstable. It bumped into itself. And we got a bad result on our experiment. Something, you see, because no, this is artifacts of what will happen in the computer, because in order to keep this from just bumping into itself, if it ever bumps into itself, you can set the computer program to create a new bead, and it self-repels. But sometimes it gets into a situation where it's recursing, and every time it bumps into itself, it creates a new bead, and then it bumps into itself again and creates a new bead, and it starts generating a whole big unavoidable mess. So part of one's experiments, of course, it's
Lou, I
yeah,
have a question.
sure.
It looks like the total length of the system has gone way up, right? When it was all in this disentangled.
Yeah, essentially the total length is remaining the same, except for the fact that the springs can expand and contract.
No, when it was in that funny shape in the end, was the total length still the same?
Is what still the same? While we're talking, I'm repeating what I did before. Yeah.
No, the total length of the string, I'm calling it a string. The total length of the string, did it change or did it remain the same?
Well, up to the fact that there's a little spring between adjacent points, and it can pull in, but it can't pull out beyond a certain point. So there's some length change possible, but just a small amount.
So when I'm trying to understand the model is basically you have two sets of energy. One is the spring energy or the tension or some kind of stiffness within the string itself, which is modeled as long connections of springs, right? That is one form of it, potential energy, the spring energy. And then the other one is between the nodes, you have, if you think of it as either mass or charge or something, there is a attractive or repulsive force that is
no attractive, it's all repulsive.
Repulsive in inverse square law type.
Right.
Is it inverse square law? Is it distance or squared distance? Something.
Given any 2 points, any two beads, they are experiencing a repulsive force. You can think of it as
just the length, the vectorial distance
proportional to 1 over r squared. The force is proportional to 1 over r squared, just like an electrical force.
So I can think of this as like the electrical charges that are held by spring forces.
That's what I'm saying. That's correct. You can think of those as electrical charges.
Yeah.
And then there's also springs here.
Right.
That's all the modeling.
And the springs, you can think of it as inertia, then it can also be like an inertia.
Yeah, but there's no
energy, right?
Yeah, you understand. It's a simplified physical model. There's no gravity. Right. There's no electromagnetics, but you could.
No, but you could think of it that way. I mean, there is some universal force between the nodes. You don't have to give it any name. Just call it something.
Well, but I've told you, since it's a computer program, I have told you everything that's going on except the details of the formulas, right? So it looks physical, but it's quasi-physical. And then you run into things that would never happen in the physical world, like new beads being created. But that may give you ideas about maybe modeling elementary particles or something. So,
No,
you know, you
where
can
I'm going
look.
is
And now here it is. See, it's flipping over now, like the other one. But now you get to see a little more about that flipping over and the acquiring of kinetic energy by the system. As it again falls to a lower geometrical energy level, and I can remove some of the kinetic energy. And I end up, we'll put the tubes back, I end up in a different form. So it's quite interesting to do these experiments of this kind, and these are computer experiments. They're illuminating because they show you things that are way beyond your ability to analyze analytically about these geometrical forms that are related to the knots. So I'll stop there with the program, but did you have a further comment or question about it?
Yeah, I was
what is the assumption of no, you have those beads. Can you come back, return back to this bead-like thing, the image, not this format. This not smooth, but
I didn't get the question yet.
you have different formats for this.
Oh, the formats, yeah. This is
Yeah.
just these are just tubes that are drawn
Yeah, no tubes. Let's go back to
surrounding the
bead.
core. And
Okay.
this is still a drawing, of course. The
My
things
question is, I cannot show you where I'm pointing at. Okay, between two beads linked by the thread. So that linked thread stands for a different force instead of
yeah, that stands
adding
for a
adding each
little,
other, right?
that's correct. That stands for a little spring between them.
So
And
what is that?
when I say undamped over here in the control, that means the spring actually can act. When I
Okay.
say damp, the spring has a very strong spring constant. It just pulls in and it's rigid.
So that connection is from a different kind of a force instead of these.
Yes, yes.
external stuff.
In this
So
model,
what
that's
that
correct.
force?
That's correct. There are two forces. There's local spring forces and global electrical forces.
Okay.
That's all. That's it. Right. And you get a lot of phenomena out of those. It's a simplified physical model, but it gives you some things to investigate. Yeah. Okay. I'll leave that and let me just put that back. There are other experiments, of course. We don't want to spend all our time on it. Now, then I made a little slideshow that will help for some general points, and we'll go through that and then we can talk more generally. So just want to make sure I've got the right one. There it is. Okay. Okay, so I'm calling this little slideshow not logic because I'm talking about general properties of things and also about how the formalism of the knots could be used to indicate other things than knots if you wanted to. So let's leave it in this form. I rather than full screen. Oh, I know. There. And there. Yeah, okay. So so one of the phenomena that occurs is linking, of course. And you're all familiar with linking. And linking is a specifically three-dimensional phenomenon that happens between things which are one-dimensional. You can have two curves that wrap around one another and consequently can't be pulled apart beyond a certain point. And in some cases of linking, you can just count how many times one curve goes around the other, and that is a measure of the linking. Like this blue curve is going once around the red curve, and I could have another where it goes 3 times around the red curve, but it could also go 0. For example, the red curve here goes all the way around blue, but it really goes 0 around blue. If green was not present, the red curve and the blue curve in that picture on the right could just slide past one another and go away. They aren't really wrapping around one another at all. And that's true of any pair in the triplet there. If you remove red, then green and blue can slip apart. If you remove green, then red and blue can slip apart. This is called the Borromean rings because the Borromeo family in Italy in the 1500s, I think, had a similar kind of link as their symbol. But this is an example where curves can be linked with one another, even though they have no actual linking number. These 3 are linked together, but any 2 of them are not. An interesting phenomenon, and one that asks for some mathematical explanation. And there's a kind of explanation. I see, I need to make this a little smaller. That didn't work. Sorry. Okay. So here you might describe this to yourself this way. If you looked at it and observed this, you'd see that red surrounds blue, blue surrounds green, but green surrounds red. So it's a scissors, paper, stone kind of arrangement, the circularity. And somehow it's that's keeping it together. But not quite an explanation. It's maybe a bit of a mystery. You could experiment with this thing and see how it behaves. Another general principle, very general principle, is pattern integrity, using Buckminster Fuller's words. The knot, whatever it is a kind of patterned information which is independent of the substrate that carries it. You could have a grainy rope like this one, and you could slide the knot over a little bit, and it would end up on this crosshatch rope. It wouldn't matter. This rope could be made of hemp, and this could be made of cotton, and it's still the relationship of the rope to the space that makes the knot, and it doesn't depend on what substrate it occurs in. So here there's a wide-seeking biological kind of metaphor about systems which are maintaining themselves through the pattern of their relationship, and the individual constituents of that system can be changing all the time, but we nevertheless feel the integrity of the pattern of the system. And so that's a very universal principle that is happening here in this kind of topological consideration. Maybe you have a comment about that before I go on. That's the most general principle I know relating topological structures to design and structure in general, is that notion that we're looking at things which are not intrinsic to the substrate, but they are related to how whatever it's composed of is related to its surroundings and to how it got put into such a form. Now, the crossing in the diagram that we use could be thought of as just an asymmetric relationship. So you could think of that as a membership. I could say that a line that goes under another line B is going to represent A as a member of B. Doesn't have to be membership. It could be any asymmetric relation that you had in mind. So we can use the diagrams to represent things which are far from the original idea of knotting. So for example, here, I could have self-membership like this, or I could have mutual membership like this. A is belonging to B, but B is also belonging to A. And if you look at the link that way, then it represents a mutuality. And you can have more complicated kinds of mutualities among larger populations of entities like this. Here, A and B are members of one another, and B and C are members of one another, and C and D. But by the time we get to D, it doesn't have anything to do with A anymore, unless it came back round. So D and A are linked by mutualities. And if you're interested in diagramming such things, you might use the knot diagrams as a mode of illustrating something which wasn't originally the idea of knotting at all. And in fact, in a way, the diagrams are not originally what the knotting was about, right? If you think about that, it's kind of curious that we get as far as we do. Up here, you're thinking of two rings that are in space and they're continuously going around. But when we drew the diagram, then we took a convention that said, well, since I can't see it, I'll think of it as cut in the diagram. And then the diagram, the projection, allows me to say, okay, I'll go along from the place where I can't see it, from the undercrossing, until I can't see it again and I get an arc. So these are two arcs that are intercalcated with one another. And that's what happens in these diagrams. Like here, I have this arc, and then I have this arc, and then I have this arc, and then I have this arc. So by taking a picture in this way, the whole, not as a whole, becomes divided into interacting arcs. And the interacting arcs, the pattern of the interacting arcs reflects in a different language the topology of the whole. So in playing the game of using these diagrams as mathematical representatives for the knotting, we're playing a game of going in between the continuous and the discrete by deliberately discretizing the knot into the arcs that are intercalcated the way they are, by using the pictures. And that same relationship could be used for something that isn't much related to knots. For example, here, 0 is a knot set that has nobody going under it, so it's the empty set. And 1 here has as its only member 0. Everybody else is going over. 2 has as its members 1 and 0. And 3 has as its members 2 and 1 and 0. And so you see I've correctly named them in some sense. 1 has 1 member, 2 has 2 members, 3 has 3 members. And I'm building sets which have an appropriate number of members. This is a diagram of a well-known construction of sets with that many members. You could also play with Russell paradox with these diagrams. On the left, I have an A which belongs to itself, right? Goes under itself. And on the right, I have an A that does not belong to itself, but topologically, they're interrelatable. So at the level of the topological model of the set theory, self-membership is not a serious matter at all. It's a completely available one way or the other, depending on whether you want to put a little curl in your diagram or not. You can play around with that. Here's the self-membrane set again. And you will notice that there are some curious features, like here's this topological set, a knot set, but A is a member of this one twice, but they pull apart because of topology. So, so in this world of sets, if you had somebody who appeared twice, it wouldn't have to appear at all. Different rules. And those rules mean that knots are actually not so serious for these knot sets, because in a knot, it's all one label along the line and it just belongs to itself 3 times. And so it really doesn't belong to itself at all, or it only belongs to itself once, depending on how you want to think about it. But now I want to show you that if we labeled the lines more carefully, then we would be coming into the topology. And I have gone and jumped to an abstract point here, so it's probably better to go here. I'm going to color the arcs of the diagram by different colors or labels. So if an arc A meets an arc B, and there was a way to combine colors, like red combined with blue will give you purple, then I take the combination of the 2 colors on the other edge side. Now, it's better to just show this to you like this, I think. I have A, B, and C on a trefoil diagram, and I'm going to play a little game with this. The game is, now the colors could be called woven, dark, and brick, all right? Since that's easy enough to describe. So there's 3 colors I'm using. A is woven, B is dark, and C is brick. And as you see, I have a method of combining colors. If I have 2 colors, I get the third. In other words, at a crossing, my rule is that I shall have 3 colors, or 1 color, which I didn't draw here. Those are what's allowed. I'm not allowed to have 2 colors. If I have 2 colors, the third gets created because we take the product, if you like. Or you can just think, never mind algebra. The rule is 3 colors or 1 color at a crossing. And then we can investigate what will happen to this colored knot diagram as I move it around. So I decide to move it around. And brick is moving up into the vicinity of woven here. And I push it underneath. I just slide it right underneath. Now, the rule was that I'm to have 3 colors at a crossing, and we had brick coming up to woven. So the rule says you better have dark over here. And that's what this is. This is dark. And now we have 3 colors at each of these crossings. It worked. I could keep on coloring it by just changing it locally. And I did it again over here, the same thing. And then I did it again over here. And the diagram is getting more and more complicated, but it still has 3 colors. It still has 3 colors. And I pushed it here, and here brick was interacting with brick, and it produced brick. That's okay. That's 1 color. And then here, I did something which might be a little hard for you to see. You see, this is going under and under and under, and there's a little triangle, and I'm going to slide it under the crossing to the other side, underneath. Just push the rope a little bit that away. And now what this is woven meeting woven, which will produce brick. And then brick meeting dark, which will produce, I'm sorry, woven. Woven meeting woven produces woven. Here it is. Woven meeting woven produces woven. Woven meeting dark produces brick. And that's good because it met up with the other end. Both ends were brick. And when you went through 2 things, you see, if you go through 2 things, then what will happen is that it will work out. Now, it isn't obvious that this will always work out. You have to do a few cases, but it always does work out. You just enumerate the cases, and you will see that if you move in these little triangles like that, you'll also be able to preserve the three coloring. So no matter what, and those are basically the things that you can do to move the diagrams around that corresponds to the topology. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing that if you started with a knot that was colored in 3, according to these rules, and you kept moving it around, it would always remain colored in 3 in a way that inherited from previous pictures. So you'll never get to it being colored with only one color. And on the other hand, if you started with, maybe I should use my pad at this point. I'm guessing, nope. There's a bar that will not move, and I'm guessing for the location of my, yeah, there it is. Come on, come on. Yeah, okay. I just wanted to be able to draw. So let's start by just drawing in one color. So if I started with an unknotted curve, our question that I'm impinging on here is, how do I understand that this, by making these little moves, and the little moves that I've been making are the following. I could put a little twist in. I could take in or put out a little push under like that. Or I could have 2 bits of rope going over one another and another one going under both of them or over both of them. And that could be leaving the endpoint fixed, just push down like that a little bit, okay? And for obvious reasons, I call these moves 1, 2, and 3. And it was proved by Alexander Briggs and Reidemeister back in the 1920s that if you use the pictures for knots instead of their three-dimensionality, then 2 knots, then 2 pictures can or cannot be moved to one another by these moves. Is the same as doing the 3D topology of them. So the question is, can you or can you not get from here to here? And the answer, of course, is no, you can't. You can't get from here to there. And the reason, a reason in this model is the unknot always stays one colored. See, just as I move this around, and let's talk about moving it around again, and I'll do it with labels because it takes so much time to keep switching colors. So suppose this is red and this is blue and this is green, right? And then we did things in the picture I was drawing that were like this. I said, here's red, here's blue, and then I'm going to take the green, this is green and that's green, and I'm going to slip it under here, and I'm going to slip this one under there. So this is green and green bumping into red, and that's nice and consistent and produces a blue here. That's the kind of thing we did. In my pictures do lots and lots of that, right? And you keep on going like this, and you would get to any diagram D will be 3 colored. Now, if you started with the unknot and did the same thing, this say is colored red, and then you push it through itself like this, red, red, red bumping into red is red by our rules, you see, and it keeps on going, and only one color. So by coloring it, we understand that this belongs to a different clan than this one. This belongs to a 1-colored clan, and this belongs to a 3-colored clan, and they never meet. And so there isn't any way that you could move the trefoil knot around and end up at an unknot diagram, some complex unknot diagram, because the unknot diagram would only admit 1 color, whereas the trefoil knot diagram will admit 3. And so that's a mathematical proof in this model of using the graphs of how the trefoil knot ends up being unknotted. And it is an example of the beginning of a long, complex development of ways of trying to find properties of the knots that will not change under the moves so that we can understand topological things about them. For example, the one that I mentioned before actually can be done by using a coloring argument. You can use a coloring argument of a different kind. Maybe I'll tell it to you. Let's see, how's our time running? Yeah, we want to stop this part of the talk at the hour, but we could talk about this. I'll use another slide, but there's Borromean rings. There's my drawing of Borromean rings. You see it? There are 3 of them. If you remove any one of them, the other 2 slip apart. Let's play with this for a moment. Here is a clean blackboard. Here's the Borromean rings again. Now, remember what we mean by 3 coloring. 3 coloring means that at a crossing we have 3 or 1. That's the rule. So we're playing a game of 3 coloring. And we have seen that if you move a diagram according to the moves, you can always induce the 3 coloring. Let's suppose, so we're asking the question, could this by moves turn into an unlink? Is this possible? Well, if that were possible, then it would also be possible by moves to go from the unlink over to the Borromean rings. You would just do it backward, right? So for example, here is a stupid example. I can start here, and I could have come from an unlink like this, right? So if this happens, then I know that this is unlinked, even though it might look a little complicated, it's unlinked. It could be more complicated than that even, right? I could have had this maybe tip under there and come up here and come back here and go over here and go down there. And now if you're not looking carefully, it might look like it was linked up with itself, but it actually just comes apart. Pull, 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 and it all comes apart. Now here's the funny thing. Let's draw the interval. Too complicated. Let's go back to the simple one. The point being that if you started with something that was unlinked, you can make some very complicated diagrams. But when I was talking about an unknot a moment ago, and I said to you, the unknot could only have one color to start with. A link could have more than one color. We could color this one red and this one blue, right? And then this would be blue and this would be red. And in here we'd have green. So you'd have a three-colored picture of your link. It would have a non-trivial coloring. And that doesn't tell you that the link is unlinked or linked, you see. But if you couldn't color it, that would tell you uncolorability of the link. Implies linkedness. So for links, it's a kind of an inverse of what we had before. If you could show that you cannot color this Borromean rings with three colors, then it couldn't possibly have come from, that's extraneous. This arrow is good, but we don't really need this picture. I'm trying to keep this from being too busy. Yeah. If you can go this way, then you could go this way just as well. And if this was colored red and this was colored blue and this was colored green, and then you could go this way, that would mean that this would be colorable. And if B is not colorable, then B is linked. That's what our theoretical contemplation is telling us. So instead of having to think about all the diagrams of B and the infinity there, I just have to look at B and see whether I could show that it was uncolorable. So I give it a try. Watch. Here, let's say we color this red and this blue. Then red and blue make green. And green walks all the way over here. And red walked all the way over here. But now we have red and green here, so this must be blue. Oh, okay. Now you have blue and blue here, so this must be blue because otherwise you would have only two colors. You can't have two. So blue is here and blue is here. I'm just walking along, extending my colorings. Now blue and red are meeting, and that makes this green, and that comes all the way around to here and all the way around to here. And we're in trouble. Because this is two colors that are crossing, and that's not allowed. So the cybernetics in the sense of first order cybernetics, I suppose, the cybernetics of B implies that B is uncolorable, implies that B is linked. So sometimes a little combinatorial game like this coloring game can get you some very subtle things, and it does in this case. It turns out that you can go quite a long way doing various things about knots and links just with the three coloring. Um, so this goes back now to a question that Jason asked me, and I didn't get around to drawing the diagram, but he asked me the following. He said, well, in some cases, you could draw a diagram showing structures and how much math you need. Math would go this way, and the math would be getting more and more complicated. Maybe you only need elementary arithmetic here, and maybe by the time you're out here, you're using calculus. And maybe by the time you're out here using something more complicated, and you're looking at what you can get out of it in terms of some applications. But the funny thing is that in this case, the math you're using is drawings, which is child's play, and little rules for moving the drawings, like doing this, which is just rules in a game, not much math. And then you're also using this coloring rule, which if you think of it as algebra, is an algebra you never saw. Red times blue is equal to green. Blue times green is equal to red. Green times red is equal to blue. Red times red is equal to red. Blue times blue is equal to blue. Green times green is equal to green. If you wrote it all down as rules, it's an algebra. And it's not an algebra that you've seen, although it might make it, it looks a little like vector cross products and things like that. And so the most elementary things are child's play that you never had in your math course, and some algebras which actually never occurred to most people until they went to graduate school, even though they're very simple. So it's a funny business about what math you need. Basically, you can start this kind of subject with very little math, but the math that you do use starts being graphical and maybe a little unfamiliar given the way we're trained in our mathematics. So I wanted to show you that so you could get a feel for the fact that there are some subtle arguments that begin to give us some understanding about the topology of these things, and that is certainly needed when you're starting to think about the applications. But now let's finish this rant or preaching by going to two more topological remarks, and then I wanted to show you something that happens in reality again with experiments. So this is the kind of proof a topologist likes. I'm connecting up a torus with a Mobius band by cutting a hole in the torus and attaching it to the hole in the Mobius band. It's like that. So I get a torus connected up with a Mobius band. And then over here, I'm showing you what would happen if I took a Klein bottle and connected it up with a Mobius band, where this is a Klein bottle with a hole in it. That's what this is. It's a holy Klein bottle. A Klein bottle ought to have only one side, and you start here and walk along, and you go along the tube, and now you're on the other side of the plate. So it has one edge, but it has only one side. It's a little like a Mobius band. And I cut a hole. This is a Klein bottle with a hole cut in it, and this is the Mobius band with a hole cut in it. And I glued them together, and I have this. And I claim that these are really the same. I didn't draw the picture. The reason they're really the same is because you can take this part here and drag it along the Mobius band, and it gets twisted under and ends up over here. So you can understand that these two, which look different, are the same by imagining some motion, some deformation of pulling the handle around until it turns into the other one. If this went past you, never mind, because we want to get back to the knots. And I'll skip this. I'll skip that. I want to go back to actualities of knots. So here you could draw a diagram of how this hitch is made, right? And in fact, books about knots use the diagrams or photographs like this one to show you how to make a hitch. Now, the hitch itself is very practical. If you make this weaving, then it holds on that wooden pole. And if you put some force on it, it grabs it and it doesn't come off. And you can attach your wagon or your horse or whatever you had in mind that way. So frictional properties of knots go beyond just the topology, but they're obviously related to the topology. And we don't know that much about frictional properties of knots. So already many questions there. Um, and there is the whole art of knot tying. Over here on the lower left, I have the bowline, which is a very nice way the rope grabs itself in such a way to maintain the size of this loop. So you can put this around your waist and make it, and it won't constrict you as you go down, as it gets pulled on, as you use it for climbing. You can shorten knots, you shorten ropes by using things like the sheep shank, and you can splice two ropes together using square knots and so on. There's just a huge lore over vast amounts of time about how to use them. And in the 1700s, when you had all those sailing ships, there's intricate rope work which is holding the whole enterprise together. Rope work for the sails, rope work for the cannons is particularly fascinating. If you look at a cannon that's laid out, you see it has very strong big ropes, because when that cannon shoots and bucks, you don't want it rolling all the way back across the floor and breaking the wall. And then there are other smaller ropes of pulleys for getting it into place or to raise and lower the cannon itself and so on. A whole technology of rope that is no longer, of course, being used. And here's our DNA again. This is a nice photo of a DNA that turned out to be just a trefoil knot. And I did mention this. This is an example of what people can do experimentally with recombination. In recombination, there are enzymes which will take a bit of DNA and another bit of DNA and cut it and then resplice it in a different way so that this one goes here and that one goes there. And so people were wondering, oh, well, what's the handedness of that? Does it twist right or does it twist left when the recombination occurs? It's a good question, but you can't see it directly. But you could say, well, what kind of knots would happen if you kept doing the recombination again and again? If it always twists downward, the way I'm doing it, from left to right, like that, left to right over, and you did that again and again nearby, well, then you see the first time it's unknotted, the next time you get this link. Yeah, you do. See, there's one component and another component. And if you did it again, you'd get this knot, and then you'd get a link, and then you get a knot. And it's possible to set up experiments where there are markers on the DNA that will make it highly probable that it will undergo recombinations in these patterns, and then look at the photomicrographs. And they found for the type of molecule that they were using in the experiment, that it gave pictures that looked like these first four. And that's very good evidence that it must be twisting right, because if you had it twisting the other way, all these crossings would be switched and you'd have a different set of knots and links, and you could see the difference between them. So, so it's possible to use the topology as a kind of magnifier of what's going on in that micro world by seeing its consequences in the photomicrographs, and also by using the knot theory itself to see what kind of consequences would happen in principle if something was one way or another. And those kinds of experiments continue to this day. They were started in the 1980s. Now I wanted to jump to another example of knots occurring in practice. Lord Kelvin in the 1800s had the idea that atoms should be vortices in the luminiferous ether, and he had a whole theory, and it was a popular theory at the time. And he started investigating how vortices would behave mathematically. Um, well, the theory, of course, had a lot of problems. One is, how stable would these vortices be? And another is this idea of the ether really right? And by the time Einstein comes along at the turn of the century, most people turn away from the ether ideas of the 1900s. Um, and so then his theory went into abeyance, but studying vortices in fluids is still something that people study. And it wasn't until 2012 that somebody actually made a visible knotted vortex in a fluid. The kind of thing that Kelvin thought would happen in the mystical luminiferous ether. But here, Kleckner and Irvine at University of Chicago around 2012 made knotted vortices in water. And they made them in the following way that you're getting an illustration on this slide. You know how to make smoke rings. You can blow the smoke past a hole, and you'll get, because of vortexing at the edge, a smoke ring here. Or you can push water through a hole, and you'll get a vortex coming from the edge. And the vortex is seen as little bubbles in the water, and the light is reflecting, and you'll see it. Now, another way to do it is to take a circular template and pull it backward through the water. And then that's the same as pushing the water through it. And you will then see the vortex happening. And here is a somewhat time-lapse photograph of this template being pulled backward and the vortex coming forward. Now, the vortex that appears to me most stable under these circumstances is the leading edge. There are other vortexing in back of it, which very quickly disintegrates. And then they had the idea, well, we can make a knotted vortex by this method. What we have to do is make a template that's knotted. Cross-section of the template is like an airfoil. You get the vortexing at the edge. Cross-section of this is also that way, but it's knotted. And they could use 3D printing at that time to experiment making these templates until they got a good working one, and that one produced a trefoil knot. Here are some stills. Here's their template. Here's their template dropping. And as you see, the vortexing is occurring at the edge. Here's the forward edge. And it's an exact copy of the edge of the template, of course, so it is knotted already. This part here will disintegrate, dropping a little faster. Dropped away. Here's the edge here, and this stuff is all disintegrating, but the edge keeps on going for a while. You can see the knot. High-speed photography. And they can move the camera a little bit to get a better view, and there it is, trefoil knot. Our knot diagram again comes into play in the form of the projection of onto the photographic plane. There's a nice knot diagram of a trefoil knot, except of course that it's a little hard to see in this diagram without having it move that this is really under, over, but it is. And what makes it clear in their work is watching the movie and the rotation of it, and then you can really see that it's a knot, definitely a knot. So they managed to get a knotted vortex almost 100 years after Kelvin suggested the idea. And they have done some experiments about how these vortices will behave in time. They tend to disintegrate, and they disintegrate in interesting ways that lead to problems about knots and problems about the vortices. And so I'll stop there, and we can talk about some of this. So in the in-between, Jason sent me a number of videos that I thought were great, and I'm not going to try to show them here, but you might distribute them to people. The ones about embryos and developments of embryos and other situations where topology is obviously really important in the development of the embryo, for example, where you see just one cell and then multiplication of cells, and the whole system is folding in on itself to produce the complex structure of the embryo. And all of that is very mysterious. There's going to have to, in order to understand it, there's going to have to be deeper developments of biology and certainly deeper developments of how things can evolve topologically or evolve geometrically and topologically. Lots that we really don't know how to articulate.
So when we move from chemistry into the world of biology, the liquid, I mean water, becomes a necessary platform for these topological processes to be enabled. Can we perceive that?
Well, we live in a biology where we're basically 99% water. The water is the medium in which everything is going on. Yeah.
So can we say the whole knot theory, including all the topological applications, possible contributions, are actually all water-based? So
Well,
without water, there will be no knot theory, no topological.
well, yeah. I mean, if you think of everything we do is coming from our biology, and we're based in water, then yeah, we're articulating water when we do anything. But of course, from a pure mathematician's point of view, we think that we think that we can talk about things independent of the world.
Yeah, but your thinking is happening in the brain, which is also 90% of water, right?
Yeah, that's right. So this is all just what water says, right?
Okay. Water enables the life. Jerry, are you there? Gerard, what's your comment?
The main comment is, of course, first of all, that it is quite a fascinating story that Lou has presented. There are some limitations and some questions. One of the limitations, of course, this is a mathematical system with a certain type of variety. There are a number of different types of knots. So one of the questions might be, is the number of different types of knots sufficient to actually model all the different types of biological forms that have appeared, that we can find in nature? So that's one question.
Wait, before you go on, I should mention that, of course, there was never any intent to say that knots themselves form a complete system for modeling biology. Knots are, I'm using knots here as an example of a number of things. Topology, and topology is topology of other things like surfaces and other configurations is certainly important. The knots are something that you can see yourself because they're in your hands, and long chain molecules do form, and there's lots of knotting phenomenon in biology, but it isn't an intent to say to create a foundation for biology that's only knots. There's no intent to do that. On the other hand, there are general principles that are related to knots, like the pattern integrity principle, the idea that that if I, for example, I give you an example of it again. If I if I have a situation like this, yes, there isn't any knot on the white rope. There isn't. It's just a zigzag of rope, right? But there is a knot in the whole system of myself and the rope. My arms going back to my shoulders, thought of as extra extension of it, then I have a knot. And that knot can be transferred. So the pattern integrity of that knot can be transferred entirely to the rope by pulling my arms apart. And then the knot becomes quite apparent, right? So this pattern was integral to the original situation a moment ago, but now it's gotten transferred over here because of the topology. So topology is going on all the time, but the idea of pattern integrity goes way beyond knots. The idea of pattern integrity is the idea that in a whole system, there are patterns which are being maintained, cybernetically perhaps, which don't depend on the flow. They do depend on, for their maintenance, on the flow of new materials in and other materials out, but the relationship is what makes for the organism itself. And that notion of pattern integrity is very important to analyze further, still important. I think it's one of the things that Fuller put his finger on that's really important. And the knots embody it in such a way that you can think about it both concretely and abstractly, right? So I think the way to think about this is that the knots are rich enough to have some wisdom that we could extract from them, but we aren't saying that everything is made of knots.
Gary?
I
But
understand.
I interrupted you and you had more to say. So if you still remember what it was.
Please. Gary, please.
Let's not go into other things at the moment. Two things. I thank you for the answer. To my mind, you are quite right, but on the other hand, I still think there is some rationality in asking to what extent would it be possible, let me rephrase that, would it be possible to give some number, let us say, to knot theory and say in certain areas it is, let us say, valuable to, let us say, 88 out of 100, and in other areas maybe it's 46 out of 100. Would something like that be possible, you think?
Well, it depends on how you interpret it. For example, R.D. Laing, the psychiatrist, he wrote a book entitled Knots. There are no geometrical pictures of knots in that book. The knots he's talking about are knots of reference among people. For example, if I remember one of his diabolical ones, it is a sequence of statements like this. You are a pain in the neck. I can't remember how it goes, but it's cybernetic. You're a pain in the neck. When I talk to you, my neck tightens up and gives me the pain in the neck that you are. So that's a mutuality of a diabolical kind.
Yeah.
And he has cataloged a lot of them. Some of them are negative like that, and some of them are positive and meditational. Um, and they all are relational. So he takes that relational idea, the idea that we may have a relational situation which is composed of parts that are in relation, and thinks of them as knots, knots in the sense of linkage, mutuality. So you have those concepts which are in the knot theory, but from his point of view, he had no need to ever draw a knot in order to have his knots.
Okay, thank you. That is one answer to my question. Yes. Okay.
Another example before I
Yeah.
quit would be the
Nice
work of,
example,
say,
better.
Vladimir Lefebvre, who talks about reflexive systems and writes down equations of reflexivity and diagrams of reflexive interrelationships. And all of that, he wasn't thinking of knot theory, but he's diagramming reflexive interrelationship. And the knot theory is full of diagramming of that type for its own purposes. So if you're going to rate something as not theoretic, I guess you'd have to decide at what level of the metaphor you're going to rate it. One more example would be Gordon Pask's conversation theory as he illustrated it. You have to look at that, but it's full of topological diagrams. Some are not, some are surfaces, and it's all about how relationship, complicated as it is, can be thought of topologically.
Yeah. Okay. No, I got that. Thank you.
Ram? Ram, you have a comment? Question?
Me?
Yeah.
Actually, if I can explain for a couple of minutes my thoughts. I think the way I see Blue's approach is to start from a continuous system or something that can be represented as a continuous thing, and then discretize and talk about knots and links. Now, I go exactly the opposite way, with starting with the brain, which is made up of neurons and synaptic connections. I start with the discrete system. So when you were showing that picture with the nodes and the connections, and
Excuse me, I want
can
to
I
ask
finish?
you. Yeah, I just wanted to ask you a question. So you start with modeling the brain as a discrete system.
I think of the brain, yes, as a discrete system. Yes, it is made up of two things: the neurons, and you have the dendrites on the top and the axons at the bottom. Those are making connections. So the dendrites and the axons are making connections, right? So it is actually a disk, because the synapses don't have a physical connection. There is a gap, angstroms of gap. They are all free floating entities, discrete things. Okay, that's how it starts. So therefore, we come from opposite direction, but still we kind of getting, I think, to a similar point. What I was going to say is the diagram that you showed with the nodes and the links, and then talking about a repulsive force between nodes with the inverse square law. I interpret that as saying that there is a effect from long distance, which is the inverse square law. And then you have local attractions, which are the spring forces that you have. So we have basically a system that is working from long distance, and we have connections in the local. And that is what you're seeing in the brain as an information network. And the long distance is really, it could be long axon connections, or it could also be wireless connections through neuromodulators. Okay. Then the interesting thing, I was trying to figure out what is the meaning of knots and links. I think of now knot as actually a long-term memory that was produced by creating an epigenetic change into the DNA itself. A receptor that was not being produced before, now it is going to be produced because there is an epigenetic change. And that essentially produced a knot in which became a long-term memory. Whereas if the connection was done only through the neuromodulators, it is really a link. And after the short-term episode is over, that memory is immediately gone. So it is, we can think about this as a discussion of an information network with long-range interactions and short-term inhibitory links that are working together, and composed of short-term memory and long-term memory, which are the links and the knots. What do you think about it?
Well, I think that what you're calling local and local and global aren't the links and knots so much as as the kinds of forces, right? There is the repelling forces from far away, and then there's the local linking.
I don't
the
think of
local
it as
interaction. But in the knotting itself, I could have this kind of linking, and it actually goes across a long distance. I would have two things that are linked, right? But you can have a local change will result in a big global change. Like if you had something which is all woven up and knotted, and you make one small change in it, or the whole thing can become unknotted or unlinked. So it's a property of weaving. You can have your weaving is occurring through local weaving changes, but local changes can affect the global structure.
Yeah, it's recursive systems, right? One inside the other, and sometimes it can just unravel the whole thing.
Right. So, for example, if I take a bit of rope like this, I can begin by weaving a structure like this, a chain stitch, and I make this for a while like that, yeah? And this is not knotted. If I pull on it, it will all come apart, right? But I can ensure the global stability of my chain stitch by just locking it up at this end like that, where it's slipping through. Now the whole thing is stable. And I can make a weave as long as I like. But when I make a weave like that, it actually can be undone by just this, and then it'll all come apart, right?
Yeah.
So there's this interplay between the local structure and the global structure.
Yes, I mean that's the idea of Alzheimer's, right?
Yeah. Now, in the brain, in memory, there is some long-term memory, and there is also just a state of mind that could easily be dropped immediately.
Yes.
And so those are both occurring there.
Right. That's what I was getting at. See, initially I was having, when I went through your videos and other things, I was having a lot of difficulty trying to relate. I really understand where you're going with this, but more I think about it, we are looking at the information network, but from two different viewpoints. I think of it as a discrete collection of nodes and connections. And then the connections can be made permanent with a long-term epigenetic change, and which I equate it to your concept of knot. Okay, whereas if it is just a temporary connections that are kind of looping over each other through the neuromodulatory connectors, as soon as the dopamine is gone or the serotonin comes and finishes it, that memory is, that activity ceases and it's all gone.
Some people have played with the following analogy. If you take the Borromean rings, you can make more complex versions of the Borromean rings. So you have this big network, but if you make the slightest change in it, like snipping one of them, it all just goes away, right?
Yeah.
So this is like a thought.
Yeah.
A thought structure. A thought structure, you maintain a thought structure by continuing to think it, but you can say, "Thank you, thought structure," and just let it go. That's the way it is in the mind. So the mind's thought structures are like great big Borromean ring networks.
Right. So you think of it as rings. I think of it like the nested Matryoshka dolls. one inside the other going at different sizes. They can fit inside each other. That is another way to look at the same thing.
Mhm.
Okay, so the activities happening at different spatial levels and activities happening at different time levels, but yet you can have periodic synchronies that are happening, and depending on the time between the periods, you get different sets of things. Like you can create a phoneme and a syllable and a word, and then you can take a noun word and a verb word and make a class, and then you can add some phrases to it and make a elaborate sentence, and then you can have sentences you can concatenate, make it a paragraph and story and go on. So the whole thing is like a huge nested doll. So you the what I'm saying is, if you start with continuity, I think of continuity as an illusion created by my mind in order to, that is, the brain architected itself into be able to get over the uncertainty, which means it should be simultaneously to be able to decode both position and change. But the body organs, they are state machines and they cannot observe change because that they're constantly responding to it. They see the position. So you need another portion of the brain that is in my body, but yet not affected by the body. And that is the portion of the mental cortex, you call it mind or mentalist network or whatever it is.
Mhm.
And what it is doing is it is taking the immediate previous state of the sensorial information and looking at how it to go from that to the current state. And that is that connection that you're putting it together. And that is the illusory connectivity. Once you form that and you keep it, that is your memory of what happened the previous minute. It may be real, it may not be real. You formed an opinion and you stuck with it. So I have trouble starting from continuous system to go to discrete because I'm saying all observations are done by instruments or my sensors, which can only recognize discrete things.
Well, I agree with you. When I say, if you think I'm starting with continuity, I'm starting with some notion of experiential continuity, like the rope is experientially continuous.
Right.
But
It's a model you have.
whenever you make a mathematical model, it's actually fundamentally it's discrete. It's made out of language.
Exactly. That's the point.
And so if you track what we have to do in order to talk about limits and continuity, you see how we go through a lot of logical contortions in order to make things work that way because we don't have a direct notion of continuity. We can only talk about how to use discrete systems to make it sound like things are continuous.
Right. So the interesting thing is inside the neuronal body, you have chemicals and the receptors, which actually are alive for certain amount of time. So, and that makes it a state, that gives it a certain state representation and changing. And it's mathematically, it's an exponential distribution. Whereas all the other neurons, what they pump into it are discrete input, which are poison input. And the interplay between this discrete input and affecting the continuous state change, that together is the behavior. And that is the interaction between complementary entities. And this is what I've been, I've written as a paper, and that's what I intend to submit at the World Congress in September. That is cybernetics is defined as self-organization of reciprocal control and communication between complementary entities. So the keywords to add to the basic cybernetic discussion is it has to be reciprocal and it has to be between complementary entities. And that's when you can have one direction communication flows, the other direction control comes, and they're constantly interacting. But once you set it up with two nodes like this, now it becomes a scale-free system. The mechanism itself is immaterial, like what you're saying, the substrate is immaterial, the mechanism is immaterial. You're only looking at interactions. And this you can now build it over larger and larger scale. And mathematically, I see this as a simple, like a Fibonacci series. there's only one step that is happening. It's a memoryless. It's a one step Fibonacci series. Once you do that, then golden ratio becomes the fundamental parameter that connects these two nodes, and you can just keep scaling it in either direction. You can go from quantile scale to cosmic scale. This is what I've written in my paper. Sorry, I'm kind of using a lot of words, but you need to see the full paper or the picture too.
Sure, sure.
Luke,
Graham?
would you agree? I just have this philosophical conclusion that nodes are actually on the next level of circularity. I mean, cybernetics talking about
Are we talking
those
about like
loops.
laws of nature?
But the nodes is one level higher. I mean, on a complexity scale, at lower level, you have a general causality linear. It's A causes B, and there's no C involved. But once you got A causes B, then B causes C, and C causes A, and you have this circularity going on. Now this simple circle can further develop into the direction for more complex situations, having a node or having some link. Would you agree with that?
I take a law when we're talking about observed world, right? Like the physical world. Then a law is a regularity which has been posited or and hopefully observed as well, right? A certain kind of regularity. Right? Like we say, Newton's law says that the force between two gravitational particles is the product of their masses times a constant divided by the square of the distance between them, right? He came to that generalization by a complicated means, but it can be verified. It's a regularity that can be verified by experiment. So a law is a certain kind of regularity, and then we tend to use it for prediction if we can. But what it is a statement of a certain relationship which can be checked. Now, as soon as you have a relationship, there are circularities. There have to be circularities. There's a circularity between the observer and what's observed and many other things. So I don't think you could state a law without having circularities in it.
The laws are applicable only within closed systems. You have to have a finite volume, finite time, and a fixed boundary and initial conditions. You make a lot of assumptions. So laws are mental mathematical deductions. That's the way I see it.
But there are statements which someone makes as a generalization. Like Newton says the force between two objects is this, but he has not verified that in all cases. In fact, he has not verified it at all. What he has done is he actually has shown that if you assume that, then he could deduce Kepler's laws and many other things. And so he understands that this is the root regularity that should be there. But then once he stated it, it is possible to do the experiments to see whether it's numerically exactly right. But notice that Newton's law is not a deduction from data directly. It isn't like people measure the force between this cup and this pen. They can't do that. They certainly couldn't do it at Newton's time. Now you could do it to some degree. But it gets verified indirectly. We use Newton's law in order to take satellites up and everything.
The reason I raised that question is I have been thinking about this technology, this computer simulation technology, system dynamics. So in system dynamics, you have multiple number of variables, and you draw the circularities of these variables, and you have two different type of variables. The one you can you call the level, the one's called the rate, and you put everything together and feed them into the computer in the format of differential equations. And then you can start doing your simulation, like your
right. And the differential equations look circular, right? They say that this is a function of itself, and but then when you unroll them, it says at the next time the position will be this function of the things at this time, and so it becomes a recursion. So differential equations are always recursions, and recursions, when they're stated as equations, are often circular. They say this in terms of itself, right? And this kind of circularity is present whenever we are operating system, right? I'm driving my car, and while you could think of it as a recursion, I don't. I think of it as I'm here, right? I have my hands on the wheel. It's right now.
Yeah, so would that these principles of knot theory can be sort of combined or input into system dynamics, so to make it to the next level of capable of capturing even more complexity.
Jason, it might be helpful to understand that the nature of the equations that are used, the polynomials that are used to generate knots. And Lou might want to talk about that a little bit because it's foundational to the geometry that emerges from knot theory.
That there are equations for knots. Yes, that's
Yes.
right.
I'm
Sure.
thinking of there's varieties of polynomials that are used, and these are quite focused polynomials, if you would, that they only generate the geometries of knots. But it's the algebraic form of these equations that Jason is not grasping, I think, and perhaps Ram also is not grasping the nature of these polynomials.
Maybe I'm not sure if he's grasping that or not. But let me try making a drawing and then showing you. First, I'm just going to make a drawing. Here's the trefoil knot. And now I'm going to make a singular surface whose boundary is the trefoil knot. The surface appears to intersect itself like this. Does that give you a kind of sense of what I have in mind? It's like a flower. It's like when you look at a flower unfolding, you see up at the top of the flower, you see some structure, but it came from something smaller. And this is a surface in space which is self-intersecting and going down to a point. Okay?
That part is clear to me. The question is directed more to the algebraic form of such equations.
Yeah, I'm going to get to algebraic form in a moment.
Okay,
because,
fine. Okay.
Because this is because I can consider X and Y complex variables that is X is equal to A plus IB, where those are real numbers, and Y is equal to C plus ID. And then I consider the set of X, Y such that x squared minus y cubed equals 0. And this is an algebraic variety. That is, it's a set of solutions, and it's sitting inside of two complex variables, x and y, which is equal to 4 real variables. That's 4-dimensional space, 4 space. We'll call that V. And this is what V looks like. Projected into 3 space. So schematically, V looks like this in 4 space. And I am taking, and now I'm going to cut it up at the top. I'm cutting it with a 3 space here. And here goes 4 space, like that. And what I'm saying is that V intersected with, now I'm going to call this 3 space S3, a sphere. V intersected with a sphere is equal to the truffle knot. So that means that if you take the truffle knot corresponds to the equations x squared minus y cubed equals 0, and that you'd be on a sphere, which means that the length of x squared plus the length of y squared is equal to 1. What that equation is talking about is this part right here, out there at the periphery, this part here in the schematic, so that the knots are related to singularities of these algebraic varieties. This is one of the ways in which you can think about how knots are related to equations. It might not be the one you're thinking of, Jerry.
No, it was not. But that's okay. That's okay. I think it accomplished the answer to my question for Jason's purposes and perhaps for Ram's purposes. I don't know exactly what his
but I'll show
algebra
you.
is.
I want to show you another, which is more concrete. But there are always these funny obstructions in the. You can't see what's bothering me. But,
Yeah.
I try to move a file and there's a big black thing which is sitting over the file. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Now,
Please don't delete the last figure. I have to talk about it. Yeah. Keep that other figure. Don't let it die.
Home fly. That was the name of it, the home fly equation.
I'm trying to say you don't need complicated math in plant biology. You don't need polynomials because it's a single step process.
Could you repeat that, Ram?
In plant biology or like even in a GPS system, everything happens one step at a time. When you have only one step at a time, you don't need a polynomial. But in order to preserve both position and velocity continuity, it's like doing a spline fit. And at every point, you need to know both the position and the instantaneous trajectory. If you know those two things, you can fit any higher order curve. That's the idea behind splines, right? And I'm saying that is how the brain is architected. The mind gives you the slope continuity. The body senses give you positional continuity. Together, when they are in harmony, you get rid of local uncertainty within your observable time and space. That's really, and that's just
Excuse me. You're out of order. I was responding to Jerry's question, and you went into a lecture.
No, while
I have to ask you to
working on it,
stop.
I was just...
We only have 2 minutes left. It's true that there are other ways to look at it, but I was attempting to answer his question, and you're out of order. Could you please stop?
Yeah.
Please.
Okay.
No, we are...
Please find out what you want to find, Lou. You're still searching.
What I was just simply showing is that one can write equations for knots. That's all I'm saying. And here, for example, are parameterizations which give rise to a truffle knot. And here are parameterizations which give rise to some other knots. So it's a straightforward matter that one can write equations for them. And then there are other ways in which polynomials come in. But it's fundamental that, of course, one can investigate them by using equations. And then there are other situations like the ones that the gentleman was just talking about, where you may use recursions and you don't use equations at all. Beautiful recursions that generate plant structures. And I think he was beginning to talk about that. I'm sorry to have interrupted him, but it's just that I know that we have 1 minute left, and I wanted to just finish my sentence there.
Gary?
Oh, well, a couple comments that I think are relevant to the situation. First of all, the mathematics I find to be quite congenial to the general notion of how the mind works with mathematics and why it is purely mathematical objects that which Lou is manipulating with equations and with his notions of geometry associated with topology. And this is quite consistent with at least my knowledge of mathematics, and that's all fine and good with me. The question is the association between, for example, for this group, biocybernetics and the language that is used in describing biological systems in terms of loops of relationships, whether it be feed-forward loops or feedback relationships that are intrinsic to the reproduction of a biological system. That's the thing that is of concern to me in the area of biocybernetics. This language that is used in biocybernetics is that of molecular biology. Of course, that language includes DNA as one of the generating functions, if you would, of biocybernetics. There's a lot of evidence to support that it's a very dynamical system, as Ram tries to incorporate within his logic and his methodologies. As I understand I don't know what sort of mathematics Ram is using. I suspect he's mixing quite a variety of them on an ad hoc basis to generate the results that he desires to use for his linguistic explanations of how the brain works. That set of conflations among various notations used for mathematical representations is what is of concern to me. So that one has notations for different languages of representations, which lead to different forms of computations, which lead to different notions of geometry of relationships. Now, I've said an awful lot in that sentence.
You did.
An awful lot that is very, very difficult to unpack. And so from the Club of Remy perspective, Jason, if you want to challenge the mathematics of biocybernetics. That would be my suggestion. And that's what I was going to discuss with Gerard, but the opportunity came up right here immediately to at least express myself about what I see the situation is. Now, myself, I am my life in my introduction to my belief system, I guess, with regard to the sciences, has been to understand basically the public health consequences of changes of biological systems. This comes out from notions of what causes cancer, what causes mutations, what causes fundamental changes in organisms. And that's happens to be my, that's my mind's history, so to speak. And so I had no idea I was jumping into such a cesspool of ideas, if I can use that rather negative terminology.
Maybe you don't want to call it a cesspool.
Well, it depends on what you want to express. It's a vertex. Okay, a vertex.
Rem, you mentioned you finished?
But in any case, that's all I really wanted to say about it. And Ram's understanding, I would like to have a better grasp of what how he's pasting these different conceptual domains
Right.
into a unified whole, such that it could be related to biological reproduction and not just the reproduction of a thought.
Rem mentioned the biological events happening in a simple one step, or at least one step at a time, right? So what's your comment?
Yeah, Jason, it's not the issue of one step, because everyone agrees that things go step by step in that context. It's how we take the relationships among the steps, get such that we can reproduce the whole system. And so your conceptualization of dynamical systems theory, okay, how could you do that in such a way that at each step you're creating some new object such that the system as a whole can reproduce all of its objects? Does that make sense to you, Jason?
I was trying to make a connection between what Lou is talking about with the existing computer simulation methodology. I mean, system dynamics developed in MIT, and they use it for a very wide variety of applications. Initially, they use it to help the urban development, and then a lot of economic system complexity can be captured by that methodology, but it's not enough. It's not enough, but it's for short when a lot of reflexivity is going on inside the system. So I was thinking perhaps Lou's contribution about the nodes and the links and even some topological principles can be sort of merged with the system dynamics, so we can have a new version, I mean, an updated system dynamics that could handle much more than before. That's what
Well,
I
you
think.
see that um, what I was talking about is how you think about in the case of these systems, which are basically self-referential systems. They're defined in terms of themselves and their relationships, how preservation of structure can be thought about. Um, and so we're actually talking about the preservation of structure in certain self-referential or re-entering systems. Um, but what has not been thoroughly understood is how these systems behave dynamically in the theory that we make. On the other hand, in the experiments, you see that you do have exactly that. For example, out of a certain initial condition, you can produce a knot as a vortex. But the vortex knot, when it evolves in time, tends to undergo changes. We didn't talk about them, but it undergoes very definite kinds of changes, which are like this. A bit of vortex comes near another bit of vortex, and it does that. And that tends to unknot the vortices. Um, and you can look at the evolution in time, but the evolution in time of these systems is something that depends on the experimental situation. When you're looking at embryos developing, you're looking at extraordinary evolutions in time of certain systems, and we know very little.
Let's pursue the embryo analogy or excuse me, semantics for a moment in terms of the mathematics that's going on in terms of the material reality that is happening. Because as the embryo goes from 1 cell to 2 cells to 4 cells to 8 cells to 16 to 32, and then it starts unfolding in more complicated patterns than just simple cell division. But in doing this, all of the components of the first cell become, they're duplicated and become part of the components of the second cell. And so the notion of reflexivity here is what is in question. And so this is the biconditional relationship that is of logical importance. Is this the reflexivity of going from the, if you would, an atomic sentence to the molecular sentence, that is from 1 cell to 2 cells, is asymmetric with respect to reflexivity. And
why do you say that?
The issue of creativity comes up.
Well, why do you say it's not reflexivity? It's reflexivity turns into recursivity, turns back into reflexivity, right? They go back and forth.
That's not a biological option.
Well, you were born from a single cell and you became a cognitive being. And as a cognitive being, you have reflexivity.
Well, the fact that I was born is far distant removed from my capability of having reflexivity.
Well, the fact that you are a biological being is not far removed from your reflexivity, right? It's the support of it.
That's not the issue that I'm addressing, Lou. I'm addressing the logical notion of one of the standard symbols used in logic of the biconditional relationship. Okay, this is a logical concept that's involved semantics of logic.
Can I don't know if we have the time, but I just wanted to draw a picture, maybe. Just a second. This is just a symbolic picture, but if I start with a reflexivity like this, A is equal to an arrow pointing to A, all right? It's a reflexive equation like that, self-pointing, right? If I start with that and I keep on substituting into it, then I will get and so on. And so I end up getting a process which looks like arrow, 2 arrows, 3 arrows, 4 arrows, and so on. And I end up with a recursion. So a reflexivity and a recursion are right on top of one another, from my point of view. Another way of putting it is if I wrote x equals f of x, then I could rewrite it as xn plus 1 is equal to f of xn plus 1, xn, excuse me. And here I have a recursion, and here I have a reflexivity. So from that logical point of view, they're directly related to one another. And that's the way I'm thinking, which may be different from what you were saying. That's why I wanted to write it, because maybe this is not what you meant.
Well, it's definitely not what I meant. And I can tell you very simply why. And that is, which I've already stated, and that was that it's not a biological option. If it's one, you start out with one cell at the ground or the first step in the development of the embryo, then the first step leads to 2 cells.
Right, you started with the one cell and it
cells.
divided and it became 2 cells. And this could continue on, right? And then higher structure.
And this, yes, and then higher structures. And all of those are irreversible processes.
But the cell, each cell itself is undergoing a reflexivity to maintain its structure.
Oh, each cell itself disappears.
Well, it disappears into the 2 that it becomes.
No, it doesn't disappear into something else. Well, yes, it does in the sense of that, but in order for that duplication to occur, you have to have a dynamical system that reproduces all of the components.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's why the argument, purely mathematical argument, which you use and which I understand quite well, why you use it from a mathematical side of things, it is not a biological option because the development of the organism from the single cell is a completely irreversible process. And that's the way it is.
But there are other, but
so that's what I mean by biocybernetics.
Well,
okay?
but hold on a minute. I want to ask an elementary question. Suppose we have a single cell organism, an amoeba. Then the amoeba alternates between being an amoeba and splitting into 2 amoebas and reproducing, right? So this happens, but then these are complete organisms at the end of that, right? So
Right.
each one of these is a reflexive structure, which is the amoeba, and then it also has the option to divide. So reflexivity and recursivity are going on both alternately, like that. They're both there, aren't they?
I agree. It's very obvious from a mathematical point of view, and your definition of reflexivity, that's exactly how it's going to turn out. But I'm just saying that's not a really a natural option for embryogenesis
but this
or
is
for life in general.
But this is a biological situation, the amoeba. The amoeba is a complete organism, and it maintains itself through its own cybernetic reflexivity, and it can divide into 2.
That is the language of mathematics in which you describe.
But isn't that a biological description?
Maybe maybe there are two kinds of processes going on here. One we can
That's what
call
I'm saying. Mhm.
one we can call healthy processes, which is completely decoding the information hidden in the DNA. So this duplication goes on and on to a certain point that some information kicks in, says, okay, this group of cells is going to develop into, let's say, a heart. And that group of cells are going to
Right.
develop into a
Mhm.
lung or something different. So gradually that hidden structure got unfolded. And so until the whole baby is born, a healthy baby that start crying.
Yeah,
So
yeah, but I wanted to talk about an amoeba where you have a whole system which is
well, I
maintained.
was trying to say that the position of knot theory of that you break and reconnect a DNA might indicate the secret of what Jerry concerned, like emergence of cancer or something unhealthy processes kicked in and eventually destroy the whole
Yeah,
system. So
yeah,
maybe that knot thing can contribute explanation here. It's tied a different an incorrect knot or a correct knot is broken or something
yeah,
like
Jason,
that.
don't forget that it is in fact the case that the DNA without some knot theory going on in the cell, in the sense of those enzymes which switch crossings, the DNA could never get apart and undergo mitosis. That's one of the major roles of topology inside the cell. That in order for the two DNAs to actually come apart, the topology has to be handled. And apparently the cells know how to handle it. They know how to separate the DNAs by switching some crossings and getting them unentangled. So topology is allowing the irreversible processes to happen. That's one of the things that it's allowing.
Yes, the topology of the particular local situation is always important.
Yeah.
It's always important throughout every molecule that's involved. And that's what the handedness of molecules is about, is that this necessity for handedness is necessary to reproduce the topologies. And this is a necessity argument. Okay. To put it into Ram's context here, he invokes information theory. So certainly if you got from one amoeba to two amoebas, then you certainly have twice as much information as you started with. And certainly if they divide again, you have 4 times as much information. So you get a Boolean extension of the amount of information involved. And now this is important when you're dealing with chemical information, which has a structure to it.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like a wonderful conclusion. Rem, still have another question?
Can I say something? One of the things that strike me is that we have many different ways of thinking about something. What came into my mind, for example, is that sometimes I have to think like a statistician, and sometimes I have to think like a psychotherapist. So these different ways of thinking have been developed over time. And what we do with it is actually trying to understand what is happening around us. So to some extent, there is no discussion about what is happening. We don't know, but we have many different ways of thinking about it. And what I thought was that Lou presented to us another way of thinking, which I really appreciated. And he demonstrated what I think is a wonderful elegance in transforming the thinking in terms of the thing that is not theory into thinking about something else. So the one thing you do is to think in one way and then the difficulty, the new creativity is actually in making it possible to talk about something else in terms of what you have been thinking. So I think that is the most important lesson I took. How wonderful to think about in this way, and I really will, explore that a bit more.
Thank you.
Rem? You're muted. You're still muted. You're still muted. Can you hear? Can you hear him? You're muted.
We don't hear.
You're still muted.
Oh,
Your
Well, he's
computer is
thinking
not
about-
obeying him. His computer is not obeying.
While we're waiting for him to unmute, getting back to that matter of the biology as self-maintaining and the biology as self-reproducing, if you go back to the paper by Maturano, Uribe, and Varela, where they talked about autopoiesis, they don't talk about they are not modeling the self-reproductive aspect. They're only modeling the emergence and maintenance of a pattern in the autopoiesis. So it's interesting to think that some theorists like them were able to go a certain distance in the part that didn't involve self-reproduction, just the part that involved how it might emerge out of autocatalysis, an organism, and then that organism maintaining itself. And to get a step from autopoiesis to self-reproduction that is natural is maybe a missing link in that story.
Now Ram's ready.
Yeah. Luke, can you just bring up your last slide?
Yeah.
Where you talk about the reflex and the recursion?
I'm sorry, I'm looking for my.
Yeah. No, but basically.
I in order to share a screen, I had to find my arrow, and my arrow was.
No, you had two
there
expressions.
it is.
Right. So what I want to say is that this is a beautiful lead into the paper, into my paper. The two things that I have written. What I say in the paper is the basic unit in the brain processing is a reflex, meaning sensation leads to action, and the action produces a sensation back, which we call a physical reflex. Now, William James, if you look at who started the psychology department in Harvard, he calls cerebral reflex, which is within the neuronal network itself. The excitatory signal, when it is going in, the inhibition comes and activates some neurons and deactivates other neurons. That is an action. So within the neuronal network, you have a reflex, which he calls cerebral reflex. So you have a physical reflex and you have a mental reflex. So the first equation is valid, that a sensation leads to action, action leads to sensation. Now, the second equation is the recursion that we're talking about. So the next sensation that is going to come, therefore, is coming from the reflex, which is actually an interaction between xn and the f of xn, which that is the previous sensation and the previous action produces now the next sensation. It's called the corollary sensation, which is the recursion. Now, this is the algebraic equation, and I'm saying if you write it as xn plus 1 equals xn plus, or you can call it Sn, which is sensation, plus Mn, which is the motor action. And it does, it's plus is not an algebraic plus, it's a convolution, it's a neural network interaction there. Okay, any kind of mechanism. So if you write it as xn plus 1 equals the xn, and then the xn minus 1, which is the sensation and the motor action, that is the Fibonacci series. And it converges to the golden ratio. And that is what you get. Now, can you bring back your U4 slide, the previous slide, please? What you had in that slide was like a stem coming up and a floral pattern that you were showing. Yeah, so what I want to explain here is you have to think of the generation of this floral pattern as a dynamic process. So at the bottom from the stem, we came up, but what we came up with is not one continuous surface, but actually 3 independent petals. The flower came up as 3 discrete petals out of a stem.
This is yes, in a flower. Yeah.
Right. That is called the inhibitory theory of biology. And there is a German person, I don't remember his name, his paper is in German, but there are other papers that I can forward to you. What it says is along the stem, there is strong inhibition that lets the stem keeps growing. But at some point, the gene coding for the generation of the petals, that activity becomes more dominant and the petals start to come out. But the interesting thing is the petals don't come out in one plane and as one long surface, okay? And actually the 3 petals that you drew, maybe you might want to check, see whether they follow the golden angle, which is the 135 degrees.
Understand, I had no intention of making this, of saying this was biological, except
no, but what I'm getting at is biology neatly fits with what you're saying. That is, we are looking at the inhibitory theory of biology and how the stems give rise to the petals, and the petals are discrete. And the petal sequences are actually, if you're looking at the leaves coming out of the stems, they also follow the Fibonacci series 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, or actually after 8, they don't see much. And they also go out of plane, and so that they don't really clash into each other. These are the things that I'm describing in the paper. I'd love to share it with you and get some feedback from all of you.
Yeah, okay, I think a place of comparison for biology would be Rene Thom's theory of unfolding of singularities.
Yes.
This is a long, not discussed a lot these days, but that's related.
Right. Yeah. I'm calling that as at criticality, a discrete system and a continuous system interacting together, and at criticality, you have emergence phenomena. And that's how I describe cybernetics.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you so much for the interesting brain twisting exercises. Brain nodding.
We're nodding your brain, or I'm nodding your brain.
Okay, eventually we'll need I'm not get things straightforward to the application area.
Gerard, I'll be in touch, okay?
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, everyone. Great discussion.
Thanks, Lou, for good presentation.